Doriath lies in ruins. The kingdom needs a new king. Enemies gather on every side, but hope remains. For Beleriand has a new hero waiting to rise. A half-elven prince with everything he needs to rebuild the realm that was lost. Maya Govan and Melanine, and welcome to the 7th episode in this series explaining and breaking down Tolkien's epic First Age tale of the Silmaril of Doriath. Today I am talking about Dior Eluchil, the heir of Eluthingol and the son of Beren and Luthien. As I explained last time, Dior was born and raised in absolute peace and harmony and love, far away from all the atrocities that defined most of the rest of Beleriand's current affairs at this time. He married an elvish princess called Nimloth, the niece of Lord Celeborn, and together they had 3 half-elven children. A pair of twin sons called Elured and Elurine, and a daughter called Elwing. But just before moving forward with their story, I want to take a moment to explain what exactly is meant by half-elven. Tolkien tells us Dior was the first of the Peredhil ever to exist in Middle-earth, and what Peredhil literally means is half-elf. However, half-elf is not necessarily the most precise way of describing Dior's heritage. Yes, half his heritage is mannish from his father, that's not up for debate, but the other half? Well, it's not unambiguously elven. Firstly, Luthien gave up her elvish immortality before she conceived Dior. She'd already chosen the gift of men when he was born. So the extent to which his mother was a straight-up elf is debatable. And even if we ignore Luthien's choice to be counted among the race of men, before that, she still wasn't unambiguously elvish. One could argue, perhaps, she was the first of the Peredhil, although that would contradict what Tolkien wrote. She is herself, though, only half-elven. The other half of Luthien's heritage comes from her mother, the Maya. So, if we look at Dior's, genetic makeup, and I must stress, genetics is not how things work in Tolkien's writings, but if we were to take that look, it would show us Dior is at most a quarter elf, as well as a quarter Maya, and a half man. And things get even muddier when we look at Dior's children. Their mother, Nimloth, is absolutely and unequivocally an elf. Their father is the definition of ambiguous, so what are Elured, Elurine, and Elwing? Well, as I mentioned last time, Tolkien did write, in 1937, all those who have the blood of mortal men, in whatever part, great or small, are mortal, unless other doom be granted to them. So that does suggest, if in doubt, all Peredhil should be counted among mortal men, unless we know other doom be granted to them. But I also want to point out, A, that passage was written in reference to a different half-elf who grew up after Dior's time, and B, there is another different passage in the Shaping of Middle-earth written 7 years before what I just read, and that tells us the complete opposite is true for Dior. In that slightly earlier passage, we are told about immortal elvish spirits going west to the halls of Mandos, and being held and judged there in some cases for over 1,000 years. And in a note attached to that passage, Tolkien wrote, "Of like fate were those fair offspring of elf and mortal, including Elwing and Dior her father." So, the truth is, we have some really quite compelling evidence to suggest that yes, Dior was counted an immortal just like his elvish ancestors. And we have equally compelling evidence that no, he was counted a mortal just like his mannish ancestors. I guess the truth is, it really is up to us readers to decide which versions we individually prefer. But, honestly, either way, there is still an intense streak of tragedy to be found here. If we accept that Dior was bound by the gift of men, and therefore his spirit will depart the circles of the world after he dies, this means his marriage to Nimloth is, low-key, one of the most tragic unions in the entire Legendarium. They build a home together, they build a family, yet when one of them dies, they are doomed to be separated entirely, in a way that almost no other lovers ever are. Alternatively, if both Dior and Nimloth are immortal, then they will get to share the same afterlife, but that means Dior will be spiritually sundered from his parents until the end of Arda. You are totally free to choose which tragic fate you prefer, but I don't think there's any way of avoiding sorrow completely. Whatever happens, this family will never get to be together in the long term. This is the curse of the half-elven. But getting back to the story, as I've mentioned, when Dior was 33 years old, he travelled with Beren, his father, to do battle with the dwarves of Nogrod, and to do his part in reclaiming the Silmaril that they stole from his grandfather's kingdom of Doriath. When that battle is won, Beren returns to his wife, Luthien, and he gifts her the Silmaril. Meanwhile, Dior returns to his wife and children in their home beside the star-shimmering waterfall of echoing voices. However, whereas Beren and Luthien decide to remain on their green island and love each other until the end of their lives, Dior has a different destiny. Very shortly after reclaiming the Silmaril, he decides he must reclaim another part of his family's heritage too. He must reclaim Doriath. He is the heir of Eluchil. He is the only one who can rebuild that woodland realm, and he is the only ruler the Sindar will accept as their new king. The time has come for Dior Eluchil to enter the drama of Beleriand, to do his duty to his people, and to cement his name into the annals of the Elder Days. And so, when Elured and Elurine are only 3 years old and little Elwing is still only a baby, Dior and Nimloth bid farewell to Beren and Luthien. They depart their marital home with their children, they journey north, and they come at last to the forests of Region and Neldoreth, the woodland that used to be Doriath. In the weeks and months since the sacking of the Sindar subterranean city, the battle in the Thousand Caves, the scattered grey elves have been living in metaphorical darkness. The survivors are consumed by sorrow. We don't know how many Sindar and Lyaquendi are still living here, but Doriath was a large country and only Menegoth was sacked by the dwarves, so my guess would be there's still quite a few elves kicking around here. It's just that now they are homeless, nationless, and leaderless. Until the coming of Dior. When the heir of Eluchil arrived in his late grandfather's ruined kingdom, he and his family were received with joy by all the elves still living here. The Sindar arose from the darkness of their grief, they recognized Dior as their king, and they aided him as he raised anew the glory of the kingdom of Doriath. Less than 1 year after its ruin at the hands of Nogrod dwarves, Doriath rises again. However, here's an interesting question. Is Doriath really the correct name for this resurrected kingdom? On the one hand, yes, Dior's newly restored realm totally is called Doriath in Chapter 22 of the Silmarillion. I don't want to suggest that that isn't the case. But on the other hand, Tolkien hardly went into any detail on this part of the story, and what the word Doriath actually means is the land of the girdle. But that girdle is gone. For the first 3,300 years of Thingol and Melian's woodland kingdom, it was not called Doriath. For the vast majority of its history, this realm was known as Eglador, which means the land of the Eglath, and Egloth is a Sindarin word meaning the Forsaken. But what it really pertains to here is the Tellarine elves who forsook the great journey into the uttermost west and chose instead to dwell in starlit Beleriand, awaiting the return of their lost king, Elwë. I guess to use a way less precise translation, Eglador could be thought of as simply meaning kind of the land of the Sindar. And I would speculate this older name is what Dior's new Doriath might now be known as. Tolkien did not state that, as I've said, this whole story only exists in fragments, but it makes sense for the resurrected realm to return to its older name of Eglador. And, right, while I am wading into speculatory waters, I have a few other thoughts about what might have been the case in Dior's kingdom that aren't written anywhere in the Silmarillion. I promise this isn't going to be a whole episode about things Rainbow Dave just made up, but the glory of Dior's newly raised realm does prove such fertile ground for the imagination. Over the span of this series, I've mentioned Galadriel and Celeborn quite a few times already, and I'm going to mention them again before the end, so I don't want to spend too much time on those two right now. But what I will say is, surely after the sack of Menegroth and the scattering of the Sindar, Celeborn specifically would have had a very important role to fill. As the great-nephew of Eluthingol, as a warrior, as a lord, as a leader, I imagine Celeborn would have tried to unite his grief-stricken people and to bring them some semblance of order while they're at their most vulnerable. I also imagine Galadriel would have been incredibly helpful in this task too. Protecting wandering companies and taking leaderless elves under their wing is something both Galadriel and Celeborn will become very famous for in the second and particularly the third ages. And I like to imagine a version of that Lothlorien story beginning here towards the end of the First Age. Also, let's take a moment to imagine Celeborn's brother, Galathiel. We don't actually know if he survived the battle in the Thousand Caves. It's possible he might have been slain by dwarves, but if he did survive, he and Celeborn have now found themselves in quite an interesting situation. Whilst Eluthingol ruled Doriath, they were minor princes, great-nephews of the High King. But now, under Dior's rule, they are the older generation. Galathiel is now the father of Doriath's new queen, Nimloth. The Sindar's king is no longer his great-uncle, it's his son-in-law. This must be quite the dynamic shift for Celeborn and Galathiel. I imagine they both would have served Dior Eluchil as trusted and respected advisors. Anyway, the next thing I want to speculate on is, was anyone else living in Dior's new kingdom apart from Sindar and Green Elves? Like, what about the race of men? In the heart of Beleriand, there are three great forests all kind of growing together: Region, Neldoreth, and Brethil. But only Neldoreth and Region were originally within the borders of Doriath, only they lay within Melian's girdle. Brethil was a forest populated by woodmen, Haladin of the House of Haleth, and they dwelt entirely apart from Eluthingol's people. But now that girdle is gone. Now the distinction between the forest of men and the forests of elves is gone too. And more so than anyone else who's ever lived, Dior really does represent the coming together of these two kindreds. In the Wanderings of Húrin story, we saw what happened to the House of Haleth when Húrin Thalion came to Brethil and got put on trial for his violence against their chieftain, Hardang. What followed was something between a riot and a mini-civil war. Hardang was killed. Munthor, Húrin's friend and advocate, was also killed. And the woodmen of Brethil came under the rule of a weak, treacherous and murderous man called Avrunk. However, in one of their final chronological mentions, we are told that many of Brethil's woodmen refused to recognize Avrunk's authority. they forsook him, forsaking their homes in the process. Now, we know that some of these homeless woodmen, mostly women and children, travelled far into the south, and they came to the havens of Sirion, where Círdan the shipwright, as well as future High King Gil-galad, and a number of other refugees were taking shelter from Morgoth's conquest, about as far away from Angband as it's possible to get in Beleriand. But I would speculate, perhaps, some other woodmen might have made a much shorter journey east, and they maybe came to dwell in the now girdleless forests of Region and Neldoreth, alongside the elves and under the rule of their half-elvish king. Again, this isn't something Tolkien ever stated, but the fate of the House of Haleth is left relatively obscure, and I think there's something really interesting about a remnant of the smallest and most isolationist clan of the Edain seeking a new community towards the very end of the First Age, and in so doing recognizing the son of Beren Erchamion as their new king. I just think there's something really cool about Dior half-elven ruling over a population that is itself half-elvish and half-mannish. But, as I say, whether you choose to believe that or not is entirely up to you. However, while we're on the topic of the mannish House of Haleth, I have a couple of other ideas to share. Firstly, and at risk of getting way too far ahead of myself, the men of the House of Haleth who survive the final years of the First Age will go on to be among the Second Age's very first Númenóreans. The mighty men of Númenor are the descendants of the First Age's Edain, who lived as elf friends and fought against the Dark Lord Morgoth. Now, the reason I mention this, throughout the Second Age, Númenor's civilization will be, to an extent, embodied by their semi-sacred white tree, the symbol of Númenor, the sigil that they stitch into their banners and paint on their shields. And in well over 3,000 years' time, when Númenor falls under the dominion of Sauron, he will insist that their white tree be cut down and burned. But before that can happen, the epic hero Isildur, son of Elendil, risks both life and limb to cut a single fruit from the white tree. He then bears it to Middle-earth, plants it in the ground, and watches its seedling grow into the first white tree of Gondor. What do white trees have to do with what we're talking about right now? Well, the name of Númenor's white tree, which stood for over 3,000 years, is Nimloth, which means white flower. And what's particularly cool, Nimloth the tree originally arrived in Númenor as a seedling from a different special silver tree that grew on the elvish island of Tol Eressëa. And that silver tree from which Nimloth sprang is called Celeborn. And Celeborn, the tree, was in turn a sapling of an even more special white tree that grew in the elvish city of Tirion in Valinor, a tree made by Yavanna herself in the image of Telperion, the original magical silver tree, and that scion of Telperion from which Celeborn later grew was called Galathilion. Isn't it fascinating that Nimloth the tree is descended from Celeborn the tree, and Celeborn the tree is a scion of a different tree called Galathilion? Meanwhile, Nimloth the elf was the niece of Celeborn the elf, who was in turn the brother of Galathiel the elf. This part of the Sindar's royal family have very tree-ish names, and I don't think it's just a coincidence. Númenor's first ever king, who will be remembered to history as Tar Miniatur, planted Nimloth the sapling in the king's court of his capital city. And this first king, Tar Miniatur's grandmother, was Queen Nimloth of Doriath, the wife of Dior Eluchil. I really like to imagine when Númenor's first king was naming the white tree that will go on to loom over not only Númenor's future, but also Gondor's future many millennia later, he was engaging with the memory of his First Age grandmother, the Queen of New Doriath. And one last thing to speculate on before getting back to what Tolkien actually wrote. There is a fascinating loose end in the Legendarium that the professor left dangling, but I would like to use Dior's story as a means of trying to tie up. Here's what we know for certain. In the deeps of time, there lived a dwarf of Nogrod called Telkar, one of the greatest craftsmen in Middle-earth history. And in the early First Age, Telkar crafted Ungreased, the knife that Beren would later use to cut the Silmaril from Morgoth's crown. He also crafted the dragon helm of Dor-Lómin, that Turin Turambar famously wore when he was known as Gorthol the Dread Helm. And Telkar crafted a sword that's one day gonna become very, very famous, called Narsil. We know Telkar sent many of his swords to Menegroth to fill the armories of Eluchil, and we know that thousands and thousands and thousands of years later, Narsil will be wielded by High King Elendil in his battle with Sauron on the slopes of Mount Doom in the War of the Last Alliance. When Elendil falls at Sauron's hand, his blade breaks beneath him, and his son, Isildur, uses that broken blade to cut the ring from Sauron's finger. The shards of Narsil then become an heirloom of Isildur's house, and 3,000 years after that, Isildur's heir, Aragorn, will have the broken sword reforged into Unduril, which he will wield in the final war against Sauron. But how on earth did that blade get from Telkar's smithy in the early First Age to the hand of Elendil at the end of the Second? Truthfully, we don't know. But I would argue by far the likeliest explanation, and also I think by far the coolest, is that Narsil came to Númenor via Dior Eluchil, the direct ancestor of all of Númenor's kings, all their ruling queens, as well as Elendil and Isildur, and of course, Aragorn. I think we can be pretty much certain Narsil was among the many swords Telkar sent to Thingol in Menegroth, and so it seems highly likely to me Narsil would have been among the many artifacts of Doriath that Dior inherited when he became its new king. We know that Thingol's personal sword was a dwarf-forged blade called Aranruth, and we know for a fact that in the Second Age, Aranruth also entered the possession of Númenor's line of kings. Narsil, on the other hand, seems to have been possessed by the Númenorian lords of Undunier, who are direct descendants of Númenor's first king, but aren't in line to inherit the throne. And the most famous lord of Undunier is Elendil. We know, over the centuries, the kings of Númenor began to develop a deep hatred for the race of elves, and so Aranruth, the sword of the elf king, would no longer have been a source of pride among them. We know it was lost, along with a great number of other elvish treasures, during Númenor's downfall. However, Númenor's lords of Undunier remained faithful to their elvish friends. They resisted the corruption of the kings, and so for them, Narsil would have remained a cherished heirloom, a physical reminder of when Eldar and Edain lived and fought and died together. When the island of Númenor was destroyed, the wicked kingsmen were killed, but the faithful Dúnedain survived. They sailed to Middle-earth. They built the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor. They fought alongside the elves once again in the War of the Last Alliance, where their High King Elendil, formerly the last lord of Undunier, wielded Narsil. Tolkien never tells us what weapon Dior Eluchil wielded way back in Doriath, but in my mind's eye, I think it's very cool to imagine him dual-wielding, Aranruth in one hand and Narsil in the other. Perhaps with one sword he harkens back to his elvish ancestry and the past that he came out of, while with the other he evokes the glory of his Dunedain descendants in the future, elves and men, represented by two dwarf-forged swords. As I say, that is entirely my own speculation, but I think it would be a really awesome detail, and as I see it, that is by far the simplest explanation for how Narsil ended up with Elendil so many thousands of years after it was forged in Beleriand. Anyway, that is probably enough conjecture, at least for now, so I will move back to what's actually written in the Silmarillion. One night in autumn, a stranger arrived in Menegroth. He stood before its doors and demanded to speak with the king. Dior's door wardens brought him inside and led him to the great hall where Dior sat. The messenger reveals himself. He is a lord of the Green Elves, a high-ranking Lyaquendi who's travelled all the way to Menegroth from Osiriand, and he gives to King Dior a small wooden chest, a coffer containing a treasure. Then the green elf takes his leave, and Dior opens the chest. He gazes inside, and he beholds the light of his parents' Silmaril. He knows what this means. Far away, upon the green island of Tol Galen, Beren Erchamion and Luthien Tinuviel have both, indeed, died. Their mortal life together has come to an end. They have passed beyond the circles of the world and gone together, wherever go the race of men. They did not suffer, there was no violence, and neither ever lost the other. They grew old as one, they drew their final breaths together, and they departed the world in peace. Their story is over. In 1917, while on sick leave, after surviving the horrors of trench warfare and the Battle of the Somme, J.R.R. Tolkien watched his beautiful, raven-haired wife Edith dancing in a hemlock glade. This real-life moment was the germ of Beren and Luthien, the chief part of the Silmarillion. 54 years after that, Edith died, and upon her gravestone Tolkien had only one word inscribed as her dedication: Luthien. He told his son, "This says for me more than a multitude of words, for she was, and she knew she was, my Luthien. But now the story has gone crooked, and I am left, and I cannot plead before the inexorable Mandos. Beren was never supposed to live without his Luthien. He was never meant to know what it's like to mourn her. Tolkien did, for 22 months. Then he died as well, and beneath his name, on the gravestone that he shared with his wife, was inscribed the word Beren. Dior grieved his parents' passing, but when he arose from his throne, he clasped their Silmaril around his neck, and in so doing he appeared as the fairest of all the children of the world. The jewel of Beren and Luthien became the heirloom of their son's new kingdom. With its power, he restored the realm to the glory of what it once was, and throughout all of Beleriand, rumor ran that a Silmaril of Feanor burns again in the woods of Doriath. Eventually, it becomes common knowledge. Eventually, the sons of Feanor take notice. Eventually, that dreadful oath they swore all those years ago, the oath that drove them to perform a kinslaying at Eluchil, is woken again. It's been a little while since I talked about the 7 sons of Feanor, and an even longer while since we've seen all 7 of them in the same place at the same time. But now that Dior is wearing a Silmaril, now that he's wearing the jewel they believe to be theirs by right, all of them gather again. I say 7 sons, but as I've mentioned in previous episodes, according to some of Tolkien's latest writings, which in this instance I personally prefer to what we get in the Silmarillion, at this point in the story, only 6 of them are still alive. In an essay called The Shibboleth of Feanor, which was written over a decade after The Lord of the Rings was published, 5 years before Tolkien died, we are given a fascinating but incredibly sinister story about the 2 youngest sons of Feanor, the twin hunters Amrod and Amras. According to that story, their mother, Neardinel, told her husband, Feanor, that if he took all of her children on his suicidally stupid mission, not only would he get them all killed, but at least one of them wouldn't ever even get to set foot on Middle-earth. Feanor rejected his wife's wisdom, shock, and he brought all 7 sons to Eluchil, where, thanks to the oath they'd all just sworn, all 7 took part in the kinslaying. After committing mass murder, they stole the Teleri ships, sailed them to Middle-earth, and then, because Feanor is an indefensibly awful person, he betrayed his own people and decided to abandon his brother's host in the uttermost west, the rest of the Noldor. All of that also happens in the Silmarillion. But in these later writings, we are told Amrod was shocked by his father's treachery, and it enters his mind that he should sail back to Valinor and return to his much more reasonable mother. He also found the cold ground of Middle-earth uncomfortable to sleep upon, so while all his brothers and their people disembarked the stolen ships and set up camp on land, Amrod remained aboard. That night, while filled with malice, Feanor woke his favourite son, Curufin, and together they set fire to every one of their stolen ships. This is my weekly reminder that the Feanor did nothing wrong people are morally insane. In the morning, only 6 of his sons could be found. Amras, the other twin, went pale with fear. Feanor hid his dismay. He allowed no one to speak the truth that they all knew, but in his heart he realized also what he had done. In a heinous act of betrayal against his own brother and against his own subjects, who he claims to be the king of, he had also unwittingly burned his own son alive, proving Neardinel right. One of their 7 never did set foot on Middle-earth. I should point out, in that later version, Tolkien flipped Amrod and Amras, so that Amrod was the younger twin. In the Silmarillion, he's the elder. But the reason I think this story's so interesting doesn't actually have anything to do with the twin that dies. What makes it fascinating to me is the twin who's left behind. In the Silmarillion, honestly, neither Amrod nor Amras are particularly interesting characters. They have basically 0 characterization. But if we accept that one of them was burned alive by his father and brother immediately after arriving in Middle-earth, and the other one was forced to live the rest of his life without him, carrying that trauma, suddenly the surviving twin strikes me as someone really quite interesting. When Amrod and Amras are introduced, they are the definition of young and innocent. They do everything together, and neither really has any personal identity beyond being one half of a set of twins. But then Amrod dies in this truly messed up way, and Amras is left all alone. I'll go into more detail on how I interpret Amras's character arc unfolding in a future episode. There is more to talk about, but his story strikes me as one of the Legendarium's most tragic falls, from total innocence into total darkness. I imagine him beginning the story as Feanor's loveliest son and ending it as one of the worst. Anyway, speaking of the worst, there are some other sons of Feanor I also need to talk about, namely the three C's: Celegorm the Fair, Curufin the Crafty, who helped Feanor burn Amrod, and Caranthir the Dark. Caranthir is an interesting guy. He is described as the harshest of the seven sons, the quickest to anger, and he seems to have the nastiest temperament. He's also perpetually the odd one out. Maedhros has Maglor, Celegorm has Curufin, and Amras had Amrod. But Caranthir lives apart. Even among the rest of his brothers, he seems to be a source of friction and tension and conflict. And yet, what I find so interesting about Caranthir the Dark, Caranthir the Angry, Caranthir the Bloody Difficult, is that despite his prickly behaviour, he's nowhere near as awful as the worst of his brothers. Ask the Lady Haleth if Caranthir is a truly terrible person. She would tell you no. Caranthir saved Haleth and her people. He recognized the valor of men, he respected them, and he offered them protection in his lands before they decided to settle instead in the forest of Peredhil. Also, ask the Blue Mountain Dwarves if Caranthir's a monster. He had good dealings with them. They made each other rich. They lived in neighboring countries, and they built a profitable alliance. After the disastrous Dagor Bragolak, the Battle of Sudden Flame, Caranthir's lands were overrun with orcs, and he was forced to retreat from the north. He joined his youngest brother, Amras, or in the Silmarillion version, Amrod and Amras, and together they journeyed south with a remnant of their people. They fortified a strategically crucial hill called Amon Ereb, and they built a stronghold to the west of Osiriand, reinforced by the aid of some local green elves. And this is another area where I think the story is improved by having Amrod already dead and Amras alone and traumatized. I think a more interesting dynamic emerges when I speculate on Caranthir's time in Amon Ereb with just Amras. Tolkien gives us no specifics, but I imagine these two mismatched brothers taking some solace in each other after their shared disastrous defeat in the Dagor Bragolak, but also influencing the other in quite a complex way. I would speculate Caranthir's anger and bitterness might rub off on impressionable young Amras, but perhaps whatever's left of Amras's innocence might also somewhat soften Caranthir's temper. They might both keep the other from falling into true villainy. I think it's important to note, even though Caranthir the Dark is kind of a dick, and he's unpleasant to be around, and he's constantly moody, and even his family seems to find him difficult, and he's needlessly rude, still he is not pure evil. His brother, Celegorm the Fair, Celegorm the Beautiful, Celegorm the Strong, is pure evil. And so is Curufin the Crafty. While Caranthir and Amras were living on Amon Ereb, Celegorm and Curufin were straight up villains in the story of Beren and Luthien. I won't go into all of that again, but I will remind everyone, In that story, Celegorm had a pet dog called Huan, and Huan is the goodest boy ever to live in Middle-earth. Huan was brave, Huan was loyal, and when Celegorm told him to hurt Beren and Luthien, Huan looked at his master and thought, "No, you suck. I'm gonna go help them instead." The bestest boy in the entire Legendarium rejected Celegorm and Curufin and went to join their enemies. Let that sink in. Talk about a terrible character reference. These two suck. These two are the reason why the much more epic and likeable brothers, Maedhros and Maglor, the eldest two, weren't able to build a strong enough union with which to overcome the Dark Lord in the Nirnaeth Arnoediad. Pretty much everyone hates Celegorm and Curufin, and so fewer elves joined the Union of Maedhros than should otherwise have been. The alliance was, of course, betrayed. The fifth battle ended in disaster. All of the sons of Feanor were wounded, but none of them suffered more than Maedhros. High King Fingon fell to the fire of multiple Balrogs, the sons of Feanor's cousin, whom Maedhros loved with an intensity that honestly rivals some of the most loving relationships in the entire Legendarium, was slain. Maedhros losing Fingon, I think, is not too far away from the thought of, Frodo losing Sam. Fingon rescued Maedhros from the slopes of Thangorodrim. Maedhros yielded his claim to be king out of love for Fingon, and to mend the rift between his side of the family and Fingon's side. In my opinion, Maedhros is one of the most complex and interesting characters in the entire Silmarillion, but we've never seen him alone in a world without Fingon before. Until now. After the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, something seems to change in Maedhros. Perhaps it hardens him, pushes him to a darker place. After the Nirnaeth, the brothers are scattered. They limp away from the battlefield and flee into the south to lick their wounds. In the Silmarillion, we are told they take up nomadic lives in Osiriand, keeping hidden among the Green Elves surprisingly close to where Beren and Luthien were living. In later writings, we're told they all withdrew their people to Amon Ereb, to the stronghold of Caranthir and Amras, to recover their strength and plan what comes next. I find it fascinating to speculate on the Sons of Feanor's dynamic once they are all back together after the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, but unfortunately, once again, Tolkien doesn't tell us anything specific. All we know is that 32 years after the fifth battle, rumour reached them that their father's Silmaril, their Silmaril, was burning again in the woods of Doriath. And some guy called Dior Eluchil believed it belongs to him. The oath of Feanor stirs. Each of the brothers feels its burden. If they could reclaim just one Silmaril, perhaps the weight of that burden might be relieved. With a Silmaril, perhaps they could unite a Noldorine resistance and retake the other two from the Dark Lord. Their oath must be fulfilled. The Silmaril of Doriath must return to the Sons of Feanor. If King Dior yields it freely, they suppose there won't have to be violence, like at Alqualonde. But if he doesn't, and I'll remind you, both Celegorm and Curufin tried in the past to murder both Beren and Luthien, so there's a decent chance he won't yield it freely. Well, in that case, the Sons of Feanor will start counting down to a second kinslaying. And that is what I'll talk all about in the next episode, the final installment in this series about the Silmaril of Doriath and the ruin that follows in its wake. So, to make sure you don't miss it, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to click like and leave a comment on this video if you want to. You can also support the channel now on Patreon or Ko-fi if you'd like to, so follow the links in the description to those pages if you are at all interested. And a great big thank you to all of you who have already donated. However, until next time, as always, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Nevair, Melanin.